Why don't most people know who they really are? That's the question we're exploring today through the lens of Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst who founded analytical psychology. Jung believed that the journey to self-knowledge is not only the most important journey we can take, it is also the most difficult. And that difficulty begins with a fundamental fact: we are strangers to ourselves. Most people spend their lives wearing masks. Jung called these masks the persona. The persona is the social face the individual presents to the world. It is the image you want others to see, whether it's being polite in public, professional at work, or friendly at parties. But the persona is not the self. It's a fragment, a performance. And if you identify too strongly with it, you become alienated from your inner reality. You begin to mistake the mask for the person. You start to think that the image you present is who you really are. Jung warned against this, saying that the persona is a complicated system of relations between individual consciousness and society. It is necessary for survival in a social world, but it becomes dangerous when it replaces your inner life. Most people never question the persona. They grow up being told who to be. They are shaped by family expectations, school rules, cultural norms, and social media. From a young age, we are conditioned to perform roles: the obedient child, the high-achieving student, the reliable worker, the likable friend. But these roles are external. They are shaped by society's expectations, not by the individual's inner truth. Jung argued that until we make the unconscious conscious, it will direct our lives, and we will call it fate. That means the things we don't understand about ourselves, our hidden motives, repressed emotions, and unexamined fears, are actually the things that control us the most. Jung believed that every individual has both a conscious personality and an unconscious counterpart. The unconscious is not just a storage place for forgotten memories. It is a living force, full of archetypes, instincts, and energies that influence how we think, feel, and act. And the central task of psychological growth, what Jung called individuation, is the process of becoming aware of these hidden aspects of the self. Individuation is not about becoming someone else. It's about becoming who you truly are beneath the conditioning at the roles. But that requires something few people are willing to do. It requires turning inward and facing the shadow. The shadow is perhaps Jung's most famous concept. It refers to the parts of ourselves that we deny, suppress, or refuse to acknowledge. These are our darker impulses, our shame, our envy, our anger, our hidden desires. Most people avoid the shadow because it's uncomfortable. It threatens the image we have of ourselves as good, moral, competent people. But Jung insisted that integrating the shadow is essential. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, he wrote, but by making the darkness conscious. In other words, you cannot truly know yourself until you confront the parts of you that you don't want to see. Why do people avoid this? Because it's painful. It's much easier to project our shadow onto others, to blame the world, to see enemies outside instead of inside. Projection is a defense mechanism. It allows us to preserve our ego by disowning our flaws. But projection is also a trap. It keeps us in ignorance. It keeps us from growth. If you want to know who you really are, you have to reclaim those projections. You have to say, that thing I hate out there, how is it also in me? This is not a journey for the faint of heart. It requires courage, honesty, and a willingness to suffer. Jung did not believe in shortcuts. He did not offer easy answers. He saw the human psyche as a vast and complex system full of contradictions. He believed that we contain within us both good and evil, light and dark, reason and madness. And to become whole, we must face all of it. That's why most people don't know who they are. Because knowing who you are is not a matter of taking a personality test or choosing a label. It is the lifelong work of integrating the fragmented parts of the self into a unified whole. In modern society, this work is harder than ever. We live in a world of distraction, performance, and illusion. Social media encourages us to curate personas. Consumer culture tells us that our identity is something we buy. Political culture tells us that we are either one thing or another, left or right, good or bad, with us or against us. But the truth of the psyche is more complicated. You are not one thing. You are many things. You are a multiplicity of drives, desires, memories, dreams, and fears. Jung believed that every individual is unique, and that the greatest tragedy is to live a life of imitation rather than self-discovery. Let's go deeper into Jung's idea of the self. For Jung, the self is the totality of the psyche, both conscious and unconscious. It is not the ego, which is just the center of conscious awareness. The ego says, I am this. But the self is the whole of what you are, including what you do not yet know about yourself. And the goal of life, in Jung's view, is to realize the self. That is the goal of individuation. But individuation is not about perfection. It's about wholeness. It's about integrating the shadow, reconciling opposites, and living from your deepest truth. Jung often used symbols to describe the self. One of his most famous was the mandala, a circular image representing wholeness, balance, and unity. He found mandalas appearing spontaneously in the dreams of his patients during times of inner transformation. These symbols pointed toward a deep organizing principle in the psyche. The self is not something we invent. It is something that reveals itself over time as we listen to our dreams, reflect on our patterns, and confront our unconscious. But this kind of reflection is rare. Most people are too busy, or too afraid, or too distracted. They do not turn inward because the inner world feels like chaos, and in many ways, it is. But Jung believed that beneath the chaos there is order, an inner order that the psyche seeks to realize. That's why people have crises, midlife crises, existential crises, identity crises. These are not random. They are calls from the unconscious, signals that the life we are living is not aligned with who we truly are. And those who ignore the call often end up feeling empty, anxious, or depressed. Knowing yourself is not a luxury. It is a necessity. It is the foundation of meaning, purpose, and peace. Jung believed that the modern world suffers from a loss of soul. People are spiritually hungry but don't know where to turn. They look to politics, technology, or ideology for answers. But the real journey is inward. The real answers are within. And that's why Jung's work remains so powerful. It reminds us that the self is not given, it must be discovered. And discovery begins with the willingness to question everything you think you know about yourself. We must also consider the role of dreams in Jung's psychology. Jung saw dreams not as meaningless noise, but as messages from the unconscious. They are symbolic expressions of what the conscious mind cannot yet understand. When we dream, we glimpse the parts of ourselves that are hidden. The dream might reveal a fear we've been denying, a desire we've repressed, or a conflict we haven't resolved. Jung encouraged people to write down their dreams, to analyze them, to reflect on the symbols. Because in doing so, we open a dialogue with the deeper self. We begin to listen to the inner voice that speaks not in logic, but in metaphor. This is the beginning of psychological depth. Most people live on the surface. They chase pleasure, avoid pain, and follow the crowd. But the soul longs for depth. It longs to be seen, to be known, to be whole. Jung said that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. That's the core of our problem. We distract ourselves with noise, with achievement, with identity, with ideology, all to avoid the one thing that truly matters: the confrontation with the self. So why don't most people know who they really are? Because they've never looked. They've looked outward. They've looked at others, they've looked at labels and roles and expectations, but they've never looked within. And that's where the truth is. That's where the journey begins. If the first part of our journey helped us understand the masks we wear and the shadows we avoid, this second part will take us deeper into the architecture of the unconscious, the power of archetypes, and the path of individuation. Carl Jung believed that to truly know yourself, you must explore not only your personal history, but also the collective forces that shape human experience across time. This means looking beyond the individual to what he called the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious is one of Jung's most original and controversial ideas. He argued that in addition to our personal unconscious, which contains forgotten memories and repressed experiences, there exists a deeper layer of the unconscious that is universal. This collective unconscious is made up of archetypes, primordial images and patterns of behavior that all humans share, regardless of culture, time, or upbringing. These archetypes live within us. They shape our dreams, our myths, our religions, and our behavior. They are not inherited ideas, but inherited potentials, forms without content that structure how we perceive the world. Some of the most important archetypes include the hero, the mother, the wise old man, the trickster, the shadow, and the anima and animus. Each archetype represents a certain aspect of human experience. The hero stands for courage and transformation. The mother symbolizes care, nourishment, and protection. The shadow represents everything we deny about ourselves. The anima and animus are the inner feminine and masculine within each of us. When these archetypes appear in dreams, art, or literature, they are not just symbols. They are expressions of the psyche's inner reality. Understanding archetypes is essential if we want to understand ourselves, because these patterns shape the way we see the world. They form the foundation of our values, our fears, and our goals. For example, if you are caught in a hero narrative, you might feel driven to prove yourself, to overcome obstacles, to achieve greatness. But what happens if the story no longer fits? What if the quest becomes meaningless? What if the dragon you're trying to slay is actually a part of you? Jung believed that psychological problems often arise when we are possessed by archetypes we don't understand. The archetype takes over and we begin to act out a story that doesn't belong to us. We become characters in a myth we didn't choose. This is why self-knowledge is so difficult, because it's not just about knowing your memories or your personality traits. It's about recognizing the deep patterns that operate through you, patterns that were here long before you were born. Jung didn't invent these patterns. He discovered them in the dreams of his patients, in the myths of ancient cultures, in the visions of mystics. and in the stories that repeat across civilizations. He believed that the psyche speaks in symbols and that to become whole we must learn the symbolic language of the soul. One of the most powerful archetypal processes in Jung's system is the journey of individuation. This is the process by which a person becomes a true individual, not by separating from the world, but by integrating the many parts of the self into a coherent whole. Individuation requires the confrontation with the unconscious. It requires listening to dreams, facing the shadow, encountering the anima or animus, and ultimately aligning the ego with the self, the inner source of wisdom and wholeness. Jung compared this process to alchemy, the ancient art of turning base metals into gold. But the alchemical gold is not material. It is psychological and spiritual. It is the transformation of the soul. But individuation is not easy. It often begins with a crisis, a breakdown, a loss of meaning. Something shatters, your identity, your career, your belief system, and you are forced to ask, who am I really? That's the entry point, the moment when the old story no longer works. Jung said that there is no coming to consciousness without pain. And that pain is necessary, because it's what drives us inward. It's what forces us to question, to search, to see through the illusion. The ego resists this process. The ego wants control, certainty, and consistency. But the unconscious is chaotic. It is irrational, mysterious, and full of contradictions. Jung wrote that the psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. That means what you don't face inside yourself becomes your reality. Your relationships, your struggles, your failures, they mirror your inner conflicts. And unless you look within, you'll keep repeating the same patterns. This is why shadow work is central to individuation. Most people think of themselves as good, but Jung reminded us that we all have a dark side, and the more we deny it, the more power it has. The shadow is not evil in itself. It contains all the parts of ourselves that we've rejected, hidden, or never developed. It might be your anger, your sexuality, your ambition, your vulnerability. Integrating the shadow doesn't mean acting out its impulses. It means acknowledging them, giving them a voice, understanding their roots, and finding a way to live with them consciously. Jung also emphasized the importance of the anima and animus, the inner feminine in men and the inner masculine in women. These are not gender roles, but psychological energies. The anima is associated with emotion, intuition, and connection. The animus is associated with logic, structure, and action. Most people are unaware of these inner figures. They project them onto others. Men idealize women, women idealize men, and relationships become confused, dependent, and dramatic. But when you recognize these inner energies, you stop projecting. You start relating from a place of wholeness. You no longer need someone else to complete you because you are learning to complete yourself. Dreams play a vital role in this process. Jung believed that the dream is the theater of the unconscious. Every night, your psyche puts on a play, showing you what you need to see. Sometimes the message is clear, sometimes it's symbolic, but it's always meaningful. If you ignore your dreams, you are ignoring the deepest voice inside you. Jung encouraged his patients to keep dream journals, to draw their dreams, to meditate on their meaning. Because the dream can reveal the next step on your journey. Jung didn't believe in quick fixes. He didn't think therapy was about eliminating symptoms. He believed it was about helping the individual grow, mature, and become whole. That means learning to live with paradox, to embrace both light and dark, to accept uncertainty, to listen to the soul. The modern world tells us to be productive, to be successful, to be certain. But the soul doesn't care about success. It cares about truth. It cares about meaning. And meaning is something you have to find for yourself. No one can give it to you. So why don't most people know who they really are? Because they've never taken the journey inward. Because they've been living someone else's story. Because they've been afraid to confront the unknown. Jung said that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But it's a privilege that comes with responsibility. You have to be willing to face your wounds, your illusions, your projections. You have to be willing to suffer. Because suffering is not always a sign that something is wrong. Sometimes it's a sign that something real is trying to be born. We live in a world that avoids suffering, that medicates pain, that distracts from discomfort. But Jung believed that suffering has a purpose. It breaks down the false self. It reveals the cracks in the ego. It opens the door to transformation. If you want to know who you really are, you have to go through the fire. There's no other way. The journey of individuation is not linear. It's a spiral. You revisit the same themes again and again, each time at a deeper level. You think you've integrated the shadow, and then it returns in a new form. You think you've found yourself, and then life shows you a new part you didn't know existed. This is the nature of the psyche. It is not a fixed identity. It is an unfolding mystery. And that's the beauty of Jung's vision. He didn't reduce people to types or labels. He saw each person as a unique soul with a unique path. He believed that healing is not about conformity. It's about becoming the person you were meant to be. And that person is not found in the outside world. That person is found in the depths of your own being. In our next part, we'll explore what this journey looks like in real life. How do people experience transformation? What are the signs that you're on the path to individuation? And what can we learn from Jung's own life about the courage it takes to become yourself? To understand why most people don't know who they really are, we must not only explore Jung's theories, but also what those theories look like in the real world. What does transformation feel like? How do you know if you're becoming more conscious, or if you're simply repeating old patterns? Carl Jung didn't just create a theoretical framework, he lived it. And through his life, his writings, and his therapeutic work, he left behind a blueprint for the difficult but rewarding journey to self-knowledge. Jung's own life was marked by deep introspection and personal crisis. In 1913, after a painful break with Freud and the psychoanalytic movement, Jung experienced what he later called a confrontation with the unconscious. For years, he was flooded with visions, fantasies, and dreams that he didn't understand. Rather than dismissing these experiences, he recorded them in what would later become his famous Red Book. In that journal, Jung allowed himself to descend into the depths of his own psyche. He met archetypal figures, engaged in dialogues with his soul, and uncovered the roots of his own personal mythology. This was not madness. It was method. It was the beginning of individuation. Jung showed us that to truly know who you are, you must be willing to enter the unknown, what he called the night sea journey, the descent into the underworld of the self. Most people avoid this descent because they fear what they'll find. They fear losing control, losing certainty, or losing identity. But Jung believed that what we find in the unconscious is not just darkness. It's also creativity, vitality, and renewal. He wrote, "The cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek. The treasure is your true self, but you cannot reach it by staying on the surface. You must go into the depths. You must face your fears, your contradictions, your forgotten wounds. Only then can you emerge with a deeper sense of who you are." Transformation does not happen all at once. It happens in stages. And each stage brings its own challenges. The first stage is usually disillusionment. Something happens that cracks the persona. The mask you've worn begins to slip. Maybe it's a breakup, a job loss, a health crisis, or simply a growing sense of emptiness. You begin to question the story you've been living. You ask, is this really me? This is the call to adventure, the moment when the unconscious begins to stir. The next stage is confrontation. You begin to see parts of yourself you didn't want to see. You realize how much you've been projecting onto others. You feel anger, shame, grief. This is the shadow rising, and it can be overwhelming. But Jung taught that this is a necessary part of the process. The emotions are not problems to be solved. They are signals from the soul. They are asking to be heard, felt, and integrated. As you move deeper, you may encounter the anima or animus, your inner opposite. If you are a man, you may begin to connect with your capacity for emotion, intuition, and receptivity. If you are a woman, you may begin to develop your inner strength, clarity, and direction. These energies are not about gender, they are about wholeness. Most people are lopsided. They develop only one side of the psyche, usually the one rewarded by culture. But individuation means becoming balanced. It means becoming more than what society says you should be. Another sign that you are on the path is that your dreams begin to change. They become more vivid, more symbolic, more instructive. You may dream of animals, strange figures, ancient landscapes. Jung believed that dreams are compensatory. They show you what you are missing in your conscious life. If you are too rigid, the dream may be chaotic. If you are too passive, the dream may be full of action. The psyche wants balance, and the dream is the guide. As the process deepens, you may experience synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that seem to defy logic. Jung believed that these are signs that the inner and outer worlds are aligning. When you're on the right path, the world begins to reflect your inner journey. You meet the right people, read the right book, receive the right message at the right time. These are not accidents. They are expressions of the self, the deeper intelligence of the psyche guiding you toward wholeness. Eventually, if you stay on the path, you begin to feel a new kind of strength. Not the strength of control or domination, but the strength of integration. You become less reactive, less attached to roles, less afraid of the unknown. You stop needing to prove yourself. You stop living for others' approval. You begin to live from within. Jung called this the emergence of the self, the true center of the psyche. The self is not the ego. The ego says, I am this or that. The self says, I am all of this. It includes the contradictions, it holds the opposites, it embraces the totality of your being. But this journey is never finished. Individuation is not a destination. It is a process that unfolds throughout life. Jung said that life itself is the journey toward individuation. And that means there will always be more to uncover, more to integrate, more to understand. The goal is not perfection, but wholeness, not happiness, but meaning. And meaning is something you create by living in alignment with your deepest truth. So why don't most people know who they really are? Because this journey requires courage. It requires a willingness to suffer, to be alone, to question everything you've been taught. It requires turning away from distraction, performance, and superficial identity, and turning toward depth, silence, and the symbolic life. It requires listening to your dreams, feeling your emotions, facing your fears, and following the thread of meaning wherever it leads. Most people are not willing to do this, not because they are weak, but because they are afraid. And that fear is understandable. The unconscious is vast. The shadow is real. The old identity must die before the new one can be born. But for those who are willing, the reward is immense. You become rooted. You become resilient. You become whole. You no longer live someone else's life. You live your own. You no longer wear a mask. You embody your truth. You no longer run from the unknown. You walk into it with open eyes. This is what it means to know who you really are. Carl Jung gave us the tools, the language, and the vision to take this journey. But the journey itself is yours. No one can walk it for you. No one can give you your soul. You must reclaim it yourself. And that reclamation is the most important work you will ever do. Not just for you, but for the world. Because the more conscious you become, the more conscious the world becomes. The more you heal, the more healing becomes possible. Jung believed that the fate of humanity depends on the psychological maturity of individuals. That means your inner work matters. It is not selfish. It is sacred. So if you've ever felt lost, fragmented, or uncertain, if you've ever wondered who you really are, know that you are not alone. You are being called, not by society, not by ideology, but by your own soul. The call is not always loud. Sometimes it's a whisper, a dream, a moment of stillness. But if you listen, really listen, you will hear it. And when you do, the journey begins. This is what Jung taught us, that we are not just egos, we are not just roles. We are not just products of our environment. We are mysteries, living symbols, walking myths. And to know ourselves is to awaken to that mystery, not to solve it, but to live it. With honesty, with courage, with reverence. That is why most people don't know who they really are. And that is also why you can.